Hello, so welcome to Lecture 3. Today we're going to be looking at screening, assessment and multi-agency working. My name's Helen Grimes, we will have already met, and as you know I'm an associate tutor at Cardiff Metropolitan and also a specialist teacher and assessor. So in this session we're going to be looking at the purpose of assessing pupils. We'll be considering when we might need to assess and at what level. We'll be looking at the process of assessing pupils, how we actually carry out those assessments, and looking at a range of different methods, for example, screening, formal assessment, and also informal assessments and observations, and how those impact and inform the teaching and learning process. We'll also be looking at analysing multi-agency working and taking a quick look at other professionals that might also contribute to the assessment process. We'll be looking at issues surrounding early identification, and then in your set tasks you'll be reviewing school policies and practice, taking a deeper look into the role of ICT in screening as well. So firstly we want to think about why we assess. What is the purpose of assessing? There's a few different reasons that we might want to do an assessment. It might be to inform decisions about the types of interventions or the type of support that pupil needs. It might be to identify the pupil's strengths as well as areas of difficulty. It can be quite important to identify those strengths because it can give us a real key information as to how we can use them to support their areas of difficulty. To monitor and evaluate progress, obviously keeping a constant track of how they're doing, how they might be progressing. To make policy decisions at local authority or school level. To predict the success or likelihood of success for that individual, particularly if they've got some hidden strengths, and to also conduct research into dyslexia further. There's also the really important point that this assessment might serve a really important purpose for the individual with dyslexia. Jackie Stewart, a former Formula 1 racing driver, says for a dyslexic who does not yet know they're dyslexic, life is like a big high wall you never think you will be able to climb or get over. The moment you understand there's something called dyslexia and there are ways of getting around the problem, the whole world opens up. Now I know that he was diagnosed with dyslexia as an adult, and so for him it had caused him considerable difficulty, and when he was actually received his diagnosis it shed light on a whole range of issues and problems that he had and just assumed and put down to just him not being very academic or intelligent, and he certainly found it to be an incredibly positive experience. One of the major criticisms of looking at dyslexia as a diagnosis is actually with the term diagnosis itself. This is quite a medical sounding term and obviously alludes to possibly a problem from within the individual that may not be able to be fixed. So this could be sort of considered a disorder, a defect, abnormal, deficient, broken, all very negative terms, and potentially leading to the individual feeling quite different from others in a quite negative way. This led to Oliver in 1990 proposing the social model of a disability being a difference rather than a disability. This looks at more how external barriers that are in society actually create disabilities by not including individual differences enough. So for example, there might be technological barriers that people come across, organisational barriers, attitudinal barriers towards people with learning differences, and it's actually the environment around them that is actually disabling them as opposed to something from within themselves. With this in mind, we think about the term neurodiversity, and we think about the context of the learner themselves. What context are they in and what are we expecting them to do, and are we disabling that individual with these underlying individual differences? This quote from Einstein springs to mind: "Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid." And I do think this is an important point to consider when we are talking about somebody with a learning disability or difference, is that what's the context of that difficulty? One of the dangers of taking a more accepting and positive view of learning differences might lead to the rejection of the notion of intervention itself, as that would suggest the learner is in some way lacking in skills, and by intervening we're trying to get them to conform to a preconceived norm. Someone taking this viewpoint to the extreme may expect learning environments and the curriculum to change rather than attempting to upskill the pupil. While it's important to be mindful of context for learning and making adaptations when necessary, we would still hope that people can take steps forward in developing their skills. This is where the interactional model of special educational needs, proposed by Fredrickson and Klein, attempts to strike a balance, acknowledging that there may be some underlying weaknesses as well as strengths, but it also acknowledges the role of the environmental factors and the interaction between the two. A little bit like the nature versus nurture debate, when actually in reality it's probably a combination of the two things working in interaction. So one of the second big criticisms of identifying somebody's specific learning difficulties or dyslexia is concerns around labelling people, labelling children in particular. We don't always feel comfortable with putting people in boxes, particularly children who are still developing and changing all the time. It does feel quite restrictive, not allowing a child to grow out of any difficulties or develop further. And so there may be concerns then about being sort of stuck with that label then for the rest of their lives, and the implications that there could be some negative connotations attached to that particular label. So we're going to have a look at that thinking and those viewpoints from the child's perspective, from a parent's perspective, and also consider the school and local authority perspective on that too. So thinking about labelling a child, we've discussed just now how this could be quite restrictive. We don't feel comfortable putting people in boxes, and Cormus and Smith suggested that there could be a phenomenon where individuals take on the characteristics assigned to them. So if you're told you're dyslexic and you're told that means you're not very good at reading or spelling, then perhaps you're going to just be inclined to believe that, and it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy then as to how far you take those skills, because you may just start to believe, oh, I can't do this because I'm dyslexic. Some children may also want to use it as an excuse to get out of doing things that they don't particularly enjoy because they find them hard. And so I think it's very important with that in mind to think about how we manage what happens next, and how that label, if and when it is assigned to the individual, how that's communicated to them. Despite this, Riddick in 2010, in their small-scale study of 22 children who were interviewed, 21 out of those 22 children were actually really happy that they had that label. Some of the quotes that came out of that were, I'm glad I'm called dyslexic rather than lazy. I quite like it. I used to wonder why I couldn't keep up. I'd rather know that I've got dyslexia than think I was an idiot. But it's actually quite common for children to just attribute any difficulties to themselves and to their own capabilities, and the natural assumption then is just that, oh well, I can't be very clever because I can't do what my friends can do. And it goes back to that Jackie Stewart quote as well, doesn't it, about suddenly realising that actually this label explains so much, and the penny drops and it falls into place as to why they found things so difficult. So I do think as long as we're careful about how we're explaining this label to a child, it can actually be a really positive thing for them, but we must be mindful not to let it become this sort of restrictive label. Another really interesting book is Margaret Rook's book, Dyslexia is My Superpower Most of the Time, and that gives us a really lovely view of dyslexia from a child or young person's perspective. So that's well worth having a little look at. It is quite a nice, easy read as well. Some of the children that I worked with have contributed to the book, including drawings and some interviews as well. And it's interesting because Margaret Rook is actually a parent of a dyslexic child, and so that's a really interesting perspective which we'll look at as well. So looking at that dyslexia diagnosis from a parent's perspective, Riddick came to the conclusion that parents do really want the label of dyslexia for their child because it gives them the correct description for their difficulties and explains the difficulties and discrepancies in their performance. Don't forget, parents may have seen these difficulties themselves firsthand, for a long time in terms of how quickly it took a particular child to do things compared to a sibling as they were growing up before they even got to school. And there may have been a sense that something was a little bit different, something wasn't quite right for some time. They may also be dealing with some of the frustrations once the child starts school as well. And so a lot of parents do seek out that dyslexia diagnosis. It is a very sort of mainstream specific learning difficulty diagnosis to have. It's become quite well known due to lots of celebrities who've done very well for themselves, talking about the fact that they're dyslexic. It clearly hasn't held them back in doing what they wanted to achieve. So sometimes parents do seek out that label because it's a socially acceptable label, more so than it used to be and more so than others perhaps. Sometimes parents might be over-focused on that dyslexia label and not considering other specific learning difficulties that may be co-occurring. For example, a child with co-occurring ADHD and dyslexia, that's quite a common co-occurrence. The parent may be focusing on the dyslexia side of things and less keen or slightly reluctant perhaps to take on board the ADHD diagnosis because it may not have such positive connotations in the mainstream media. So when we think about labelling an individual with dyslexia from a school and local authority perspective, how helpful is it for them to be able to give the right intervention for that pupil? What are the implications for them? For a class teacher, perhaps it would be very helpful to understand a little bit more about a child's difficulties, but then again we do have the danger that their expectations aren't correct and not really in line with the child's potential. So there's a lot there as to how that has to be managed. They may be very grateful of any support and advice from the assessor, from any recommendations made. The LEA may be very open to identifying issues and specific learning difficulties quite early on. They may not actually have the budget to be able to do this as early as they would like or as effectively as they would like. And so there's a whole range of implications for this labelling of children with dyslexia and what that means. And I think that's something that will be interesting to explore in your directed tasks when you're looking at policy and practice and also best practice as well. It will be an interesting one to look into further as to thinking about what are the issues for schools and local authorities when we do actually label the child as having specific learning difficulties or dyslexia. So thinking back to neurodiversity, when we looked at the fact that there's a lot of people who have different traits of various different specific learning difficulties, and sometimes when we're looking at a diagnostic dyslexia assessment, we may see those traits coming through in the profile. There's an awful lot of crossover between the different traits and between the different specific learning difficulties labels, if you like. So should we maybe be moving more towards a neurodiversity label? My issue with this is that yes, this makes sense for lots of reasons, for that kind of holistic approach at looking at the whole child and all of those aspects that are incredibly important when using the information following an assessment, and also looking at the background. But what we have to remember is that dyslexia is still a named disability when it comes to disability discrimination and equality law. So I do think for the time being we need to be very careful about trying to preserve that label until there's a better alternative for us. So what are the potential consequences of not identifying dyslexia or specific learning difficulties? We've discussed already how a child or young person may just assume they find things hard because they lack intelligence, and they may, as a result, develop low self-esteem or a negative view of themselves as a learner. They may experience significant personal distress because of this. Teachers without a fully developed understanding of a pupil's difficulties may view them as lazy, daydreaming, not working hard enough, not listening, any of those types of behaviours, when in actual fact there's underlying reasons why this child is not achieving what they may be able to achieve. Children who externalise their frustrations may develop behavioural issues, which again then takes focus away from the underlying causes of their frustrations, and they may end up, if this goes on, it can spiral out of control very, very quickly. They may end up being taken off down the behaviour route when actually underlying all of that was actually some specific learning difficulties. And children who internalise their frustrations and sort of point them inwards to themselves may develop mental health issues, anxiety, and or symptoms of depression. There are lots of reasons why a child with dyslexia may be more prone to anxiety, and this can start from very early on. It might be linked with co-occurring difficulties, sensory processing difficulties, or just the nature of who they are and their own profile. Even as early as reception children, they may be finding difficulties with auditory processing, following instructions, sequencing tasks, and therefore they may become a little bit anxious about that. They may be the child who's hanging back and waiting to see what the other children are doing first because they haven't been able to process those instructions themselves well enough. Also, a big focus on learning phonics and doing sequencing tasks in the early years may cause anxiety if the child themselves is that's what they're finding difficult. Riddick reports that 81% of mothers interviewed noticed an emotional response towards school from the children with dyslexia compared with other children. So they may be seeing behaviours at home, crying, going to school, not wanting to go to school, very frustrated when they're coming home from school. And I think it's important that we know that parents can have that extra information for us as well. That could be quite telling. As children progress through school, children may develop negative associations with learning. They might internalise that and direct that towards themselves and become very depressed or anxious or withdrawn. Or they may externalise their frustrations and become defiant, disruptive, or even aggressive. Those unwanted behaviours then potentially draw attention away from what the underlying issue might actually be. A study in 2000 in the US found that the prevalence of dyslexic type difficulties in a prison population was 48% compared to 20% in the general population. So that's very telling itself, is that there may be some causes of behavioural difficulties that actually stem from being dyslexic. So we're thinking about why do we need to assess then, just reflecting back on that. We might want to address concerns, identify needs, diagnose difficulties and also ascertain strengths, establish a level playing field. So not making the difficulties a barrier to their learning, giving them the same chances as everybody else has. Also to assess the need for any access arrangements for exams, to plan interventions and also to review progress. Thinking about assessment overall, we can see that it does play a vital part in the teaching cycle as per this diagram. It helps us to understand the learner's profile and their individual strengths and weaknesses, to establish those targets for learning. It informs our teaching of individuals as well. And continuous and formative assessments during teaching allow us to monitor progress and also amend or set any new targets for the learner. During specialist interventions, formative assessment plays a crucial part in each lesson and allows us to work flexibly with our learners, identifying where more overlearning is required or when a pupil is ready to move on. Similarly, revisiting prior knowledge can be really useful when you're identifying any errors that need to be consolidated more fully. When a child's first identified as being in need of additional support, it's likely that these formative and informal assessments are going to be the first indicators that a child may need a more detailed assessment or more formal support put in place. So again, the more assessment and information we can gather, the better picture of how a pupil's responding and the more clues we may have as to how best target support for that pupil. So this is obviously often referred to as a graduated response to a pupil's needs, with the first wave of intervention leading to possibly, if there's a lack of progress, more in-depth assessment. But it is important here to not allow a child to consistently fail those first initial steps before putting in the appropriate assessment or intervention. It's a really fine balance in getting this right, so we should consider sometimes bypassing stages of an intervention if a child has more severe and persistent difficulties, or perhaps if they're a more complex profile. There's a wealth of research and also anecdotal evidence gathered that early identification along with effective intervention, yields the best results for pupils with dyslexia. The Department for Education and Department of Health back this up with their research, but obviously the quality and type of intervention that follows an initial assessment is crucial. Phillips and Kelly, however, make an excellent point in stating that the younger the child, the more similar any interventions will be to the usual work of their peers. But as children get older, and if that identification is too late or later, there will be more of a discrepancy between what their classmates are working on and what they actually need support with. You can see here then how later identification might impact on the social and emotional aspects discussed previously. Obviously, there are some issues with this early identification. There are restrictions as to when children can be formally identified, for example. The Rose Report advocates that it's children who are making poor progress despite the good quality of intervention compared to their peers should be identified and investigated more thoroughly. So a child, for that to work, a child needs to be of school age and having had received interventions already, so that we know we're looking at the rights, we are actually looking for a specific learning difficulty rather than just a lower baseline coming into school. So that means we're looking at least a minimum age of 6 for a dyslexia identification if we think about the fact that they will have had to have had some sort of interventions first. Also, developmentally, children might not be ready for the full diagnostic process until around the age of 7 due to the nature of many of the tests. A full diagnostic assessment, for example, can take up to 2 or 2.5 hours of the different tests, which can be quite demanding. And obviously, it's very difficult to ascertain whether a child has difficulties with reading and spelling before they can actually read or spell. However, Rose does suggest that actually a lot can be done in the early years in terms of monitoring and supporting language development, because we know this is often a precursor to dyslexic type difficulties. So there is a lot you can be looking at in those early years. Many researchers and specialists advocate screening of children who might be at risk of dyslexia in the early years, and then interventions would be put in place accordingly. Obviously, this is really positive for those children who might just be struggling a little bit. They may be dyslexic, but they're getting all that lovely intervention and input early on, which is fantastic. But we have to be mindful with screening, as we'll discuss later on. This can lead to some false positives and false negatives. But obviously, it will still hopefully improve outcomes for some children. And again, like I said, they get access to that early intervention. From a monitoring point of view, this is also really helpful. But we do need to be very careful from a diagnostic point of view. If we give screening results too much weight, we could end up with the false positive children. Obviously, they'll get the high quality intervention, but we may see some of those issues discussed around labelling. And false negative children will potentially fare much worse because they may be the ones that slip through the net, as we discuss later on, and therefore not monitored so closely. We don't want to be ruling things out via a screening. Singleton also raises quite an interesting issue surrounding gender, finding that the ratio of boys to girls being identified as dyslexic when they're children is 4:1, whereas in higher education there's a much higher number of girls being identified for the first time. There's lots of interesting questions that arise as to why that might be, and again there's probably a lot more research and reading that you could do on that particular topic if you were interested in that. Perhaps boys are more likely to externalise their frustrations and present with difficult behaviours in the classroom. Girls might be more likely to internalise that behaviour. There's also some theory suggesting that girls tend to have better language development and good social skills at a younger age, and therefore they can use those to help mask their difficulties and to get by. Interestingly though, when you do screen a whole year group, dyslexic indicators can actually be found equally in boys and girls, despite those differences in picking up fluidly and naturally. They're still there equally between boys and girls. So it's more an issue of when they're picked up rather than them being there at all. So thinking about when a child should be referred for that more in-depth assessment, we need to make sure they have had some access to those interventions initially. But if there are still concerns about that child, if they're not making the expected progress, and even if they are, but there's other things that you feel that you're worth exploring, when should we do that assessment, that more in-depth diagnostic assessment? So there's lots of different factors that we've talked about already, but we need to consider the type of support they've had, what was the quality of the intervention, how have they responded, what evidence is there of progress or a lack of progress. And it's important to be monitoring those things all the time through assessments and through those formative assessments. And it might be that a watch and wait approach is suitable for some children, particularly the younger ones, but we must be mindful of not using this as an excuse to sort of give no intervention and just keep our fingers crossed. I think it's important to continuously monitor and continually checking up and checking in on those children who have received that extra support early on, just to make sure you're not missing something. For older children or children who might be showing more serious difficulties, it's possible to maybe bypass some of those early interventions. What you don't want to have is a situation where children are jumping through hoop after hoop after hoop, to then be told much later on, oh yes, okay, now you're ready for this diagnostic assessment, when you almost think that all that time lost, when they could have had that clarity and that clear understanding of their difficulties earlier on, that may have actually made all the difference to that child. So I think it is important to be a little bit fluid about that process at times. Input from other professionals and taking a more multi-agency approach to assessment and support can be incredibly beneficial, and it is a key aim of the new ALN framework in Wales. There are a number of other professionals with whom a child may already be involved with, or you may decide to seek referrals to, should you, through your initial assessments and observations, feel that's necessary. Many, but not all, pupils with dyslexia might have a history of some speech and language difficulties. There could be the ongoing difficulties there, or perhaps some useful indicators of difficulties in any records kept. Speech and language therapists have a really good understanding of speech production, phonological processing, expressive and receptive language, and social communication. And so obviously they could have a wealth of information to be able to share with you in the assessment process. Children may also have difficulties with motor coordination, or an additional diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder, or sensory processing issues or sensory processing disorder. Occupational therapists can shed light on all of these areas and give excellent practical advice regarding posture, seating, position, pen grip, visual motor integration, as well as fine and gross motor coordination. Educational psychologists may be involved in providing statutory assessments for the child, or perhaps in the earlier stages working in an advisory capacity. They may take a broader view of co-occurring difficulties as well. A pupil with visual processing difficulties may have input from an optometrist. An optometrist will look at how someone's eyes are working together in a more detailed way than a routine optician's eye test might, which is actually more focused on the eye health and visual acuity. An audiologist might be involved if a child has auditory processing disorder, which can manifest itself in dyslexic type processing difficulties. A child's GP or paediatrician may have some valuable input, as there may be important medical information or history to reflect upon when assessing a child. For example, if a child has had any medical conditions or has had head injuries, long-term illnesses that may have impacted on their learning. A pupil may have also had contact with child and adolescent mental health services, who have a multidisciplinary team with a focus on emotional and behavioural or mental health difficulties, but also include ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder, or autistic spectrum disorder. I think all of these professionals and many more may have very, very valid and informative contributions to make when looking at the whole child in the assessment process. So there's a lot of information that you need before actually assessing. The more information you have from the background, the better. You need to obviously be aware of what is the norm, what for that age group, what is the norm in terms of literacy skills, cognitive processing. Are there any environmental factors which may have impacted on that child learning up to date and that may impact on the assessment? What are their educational experiences? Have they moved schools a lot? Have they been attending school a lot? Is there any reason why they may not have had the same educational experiences as the rest of their group? Physiological examinations are also very important. Obviously, it's vital that a child has had a recent and up-to-date eye test. That can sometimes be overlooked when we're looking at children who are finding it difficult to read, but actually it's crucial that that is at least ruled out, if not checked and found to be an issue. And obviously hearing as well, that's something that sometimes does not get picked up until slightly later on, or perhaps in a child's school they might do a routine hearing check and reception, only to discover the child has had significant hearing loss through something like glue ear, which then will have impacted heavily on their ability to learn sounds and phonics, and it will have impacted on their phonological processing at that time. So it's really, really important that we rule out some of these basic things and that we consider as much as possible the background before we start assessing. For a full diagnostic assessment, you would always be seeking to get this information about everything to do with developmental history, educational history, any current medical conditions, anything at all, as much detail as possible from parents, and also some input from the school as well as to what have they observed and do they have any concerns, and that's all very vital in building up the correct sort of picture and image, so that it helps to inform the results of any formal assessments. There's obviously a lot of different ways to obtain assessment information, particularly if you're looking at doing a screening or some informal testing. There's observations that you can do, there's group tests, they'll be quick to administer and easy to score. You may set a whole test for a whole year group even to just assess everybody or to screen everybody. Obviously, individual tests that are delivered on a one-to-one basis face-to-face, such as the ones you would do in a diagnostic assessment, would take much longer to score and interpret. So there's going to be pros and cons for each different type of assessment that you're doing, and obviously in the context of your setting you would have to make the decision that's going to be for the best for your particular pupil. So screening is a process where the learner's possible difficulties can be flagged up for further investigations. It will give a quick indicator of maybe being at risk of dyslexia, but we have to be very, very mindful that screening tests don't usually provide accurate standardized scores. They also being used as a filtering process. Now, if you have a look at the image at the top right, you'll see that when you are filtering through, sometimes some people can slip through the net. So whether those people that aren't going through the filter have actually got dyslexia, but they haven't been picked up through the screening because it's not detailed enough, that's something to be very, very careful about and to be very mindful. Sometimes you do hear of children being told, oh, well, they're not dyslexic because they didn't come out as dyslexic on the screening test. And I would be very mindful to take the results of a screening test at face value without thinking about what they really are. They're not the same as a full diagnostic investigation. Here's some examples of different types of screeners that you will be able to look into in more detail as part of your set activities for this lecture. You can see here there's a range of different ICT-based screening tools that can be used for individuals but also in large groups, and this can sometimes give us very quick and easy ways of identifying individuals who may be at risk of having dyslexia and may need that little bit more investigation. The one at the top is quite an interesting one. It's just looking at actually using eye tracking movements as a screening tool. And here we can see on the left, you can see that this person does not have any reading difficulties. The blue splodges are where the eyes have hesitated for longer. So the larger the splodge, the longer the hesitation on a particular word. And you can see the person on the right there has definitely got some difficulties in their reading. They're making many more hesitations. That's quite useful for when somebody's reading silently. It's quite hard to work out exactly what's going on. So that could be quite an interesting way of picking out whether somebody may be having some reading difficulties, and again, not to diagnose any difficulties as such, but just to pick up where an individual might be struggling. There's different types of assessments. So we've got norm reference assessments, which compare people's performance to a specified population, usually a normal distribution, which we'll look at in a little while. We've also got criterion referenced assessments, which evaluate against previously determined standards. We've also got informal, which includes teacher-made curriculum-based assessments and observations, and we mustn't underestimate the power of those informal curriculum-based assessments and observations. They can be very crucial, as well as qualitative information gained through the assessment process. And we've got ipsative here, where you're comparing to an individual's own performance. So we might be looking again at the strengths and weakness. Well, their reading is their strongest aspect of their profile compared to their spelling, for example. So you're looking at the differences within their own profile. Phillips et al.'s model for assessment very much flags up the need to constantly monitoring the intervention. If there's no progress on a particular area of teaching and learning, further assessment needs to be done to see why that's the case. If there's little progress, revision and support, and furthermore support is needed. If there's some progress, to continue to support, and if there's a lot of progress, question the need for further input. But what I would be mindful of here with this model is obviously that we need to make sure that somebody may seem like they're making good progress on a short-term basis, but that progress may slip back if that support is removed, and that's sometimes something that we see in mainstream education, where people are supported and then they no longer meet the criteria for support, and then the support is withdrawn, and then the child or the pupil starts to struggle again. So we need to be a little bit mindful of that last one, I think. So what kind of tests can we look at? We need to think about the type of tests we are using. Overall, we need to look at lots of aspects of testing, such as reliability and validity. So reliable tests, we're looking for ones that are up to date. That would be considered to be less than 10 years old. When you're looking at the sampling to get those norms, to get that sample population and the results, we're looking for sample sizes of at least 100 subjects. That's the general guidelines for the minimum number of subjects for a test to be reliable. We need it to be able to represent the norm. Should produce the same results on different occasions. So that's called test retest, and we should be able to do the same test and it would give very similar or the same results, and that's when it's been delivered by a different tester. So we should be looking at testing these tests. They should be consistent in what they're showing us. Standardized instructions are very, very important, that they're delivered in the same way. So these are usually printed in the manual, so that delivery and management of tests is consistent, so that we know what we're doing and our results are going to be reliable. And where there are 2 or 3 equivalent forms, for example, RAT 5, there's 2 different forms, there's green and blue for that one, and same with the Towery, there's 2 forms. That's useful because it means that we can look at different tests, but they should all be measuring the same thing. So they need to be applying all of this reliability and all of this test retest reliability onto each of those forms. And then we look at validity of a test. So validity, is it valid? Basically, is it measuring what we think it's measuring? There's different types of validity. So there's face validity, which refers to the test from the point of view of the person being tested. Do the items seem relevant to what they need to be able to do? And there's also content validity. This applies to validity from the professional's point of view. Is there an accurate representative sample of items for the skill being tested? Are we testing what we think we should be testing? Construct validity is what we're thinking about. How does this test match up with all the theory behind it about what's supposed to be measured? Is there good theories behind this test backing it up? And then criterion validity, the relationship between new tests and relevant and other well-established tests, can we see that this is measuring something similar to those well-established tests? So there's lots of different aspects to making sure our tests are valid. Every test then, when we're using these formal tests, usually has a set of age-normed scores to make it a standardised test, which provides you with a standardised score. They're usually in tables with raw scores to one side and the corresponding standardised score in the table next to it. They may include a graph to give a visual profile of the learner's overall performance, which can be quite useful, and many tests also show confidence intervals and percentiles. Confidence intervals are basically giving you a range of numbers that you're a percentage confident the score will fall in between. So for example, quite often in diagnostic assessments, we give a 95% confidence interval and we give figures that span that confidence interval so that we know if they, for example, had a standardized score of 102, we might be confident that it falls between some numbers either side of that, depending on the statistical makeup and the age norming that's gone on in the manual. Also percentiles, then that would mean you say that somebody is on the 95th percentile. It means that 95% or of the population would have got less or the same as your score. So 95% percentile would be very high. If somebody was on the 2nd percentile for something, that would be very, very low. So here we have a nice illustration of the normal distribution or the bell curve. If you're not familiar with it, this is the kind of population sample where we call it a normal distribution. So here we've got the intelligence, the Wechsler intelligence score, and this would be, for example, somebody with an IQ of 100 or an intelligence score of 100. That standardized score would be bang on average. You'd have 50% of the population is likely to be above you and 50% of the population is likely to be below you, right in the middle of this curve. Anything between 85 and 115 is one standard deviation either side of that mean, and so that would be considered within the average range, and about 68% of people fall in this range. If we're looking at below 85, that's when we start to look and talk about terms of below average, and less people here would fall in this range. Anything below 70 would be considered well below average, and less than 2% of people fall in this range. So that really does show anybody scoring on a standardized test around this, below 85, but particularly below 70 would be really, really scoring quite poorly. And again, conversely, anybody scoring above 115 would be above average and considered above average. Anyone scoring 130 or above would be considered well above average. So less than 2% again of people would fall in that particular area. And as with all statistical information, we do have to take into account individual differences. We have to think about what their home background would be like, any personality traits, what learning opportunities have they had, what are their learning preferences. Environmental factors and individual differences are very important to take into account. And you very rarely get anybody with a completely linear profile where they're scoring 100 for every single test you do with them. But what we do tend to see with dyslexic individuals is what we call a spiky profile. And that's where you may have some real discrepancies in scores. Standardized scores, then you're able to compare to each other because they've been standardized. They give us this kind of reference point of the 100 being average and looking at the below and above average scores as well. So you can see in this example here, we've got somebody with an underlying ability score. So that might be a non-verbal ability score, or it could be a verbal ability score of 120. So they are within that above average range. Their reading is average, but their reading efficiency when tested, so that might be reading when they're timed, reading how quickly can they decode words at speed, is considered below average. Again, their comprehension here is in the average range, but their spelling is below average, and it's creeping down towards the well below average, although it's still considered below average. Verbal memory is 80, which again is below average, as is their verbal processing speed and their phonological awareness. The visual processing speed is above average. So this person is got a very classically spiky dyslexic profile here. They're actually managing quite well because of their strong underlying abilities. They're managing quite well with the reading and the comprehension. They're probably using a lot of contextual cues to help them with their reading. But when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of all the underlying processing, you can see why their spelling is the thing that's actually coming out as being quite weak here, because that's something they're not able to use all the contextual cues for to help them. So you can see that's quite a classic spiky profile for a dyslexic person. Sometimes there's not such obvious differences, and sometimes you might be working with somebody whose underlying ability is average or below. That does not necessarily mean that they don't have dyslexia, but this is just a nice illustration of that spiky profile. So if we're reflecting on this lecture, then we need to maybe think about, why is it important? Ask ourselves, why is it important to know if a pupil has dyslexia or not? Is it important? Can we just identify their individual differences, or the fact that they may be struggling with certain things, and put interventions into place? Is it really important to know if a child has dyslexia or not? Are there any conflicting demands that might require different types of assessment? And what do you think the ideal approach to assessment is? Big question. And might it differ for the learner, the parent, the school, and the local authority? Would they all have different perspectives on what the best approach to assessment is? I think that's a very important one to think about. So we've got to the stage where we think about your directed tasks ready for next week to discuss. So if you can search for and research dyslexia screeners. We talked briefly about dyslexia screening earlier on in the lecture. We did talk about the fact that it doesn't always catch everybody, and that it may not give us a detailed picture, but possibly as a filtering tool it could be useful. So if you can find out and research a little bit more about the different types, find out in your setting, if you're in an educational setting already, what does your setting use to identify anybody with dyslexic type difficulties? And if you're not in that setting, or if your setting does not really identify dyslexic type difficulties, then by all means just do the research on the different types of screeners. Number 2 would be considering the use of assessment in your setting, looking at the main purposes for which it's used, identifying the types of assessments, why are they used, what are they used for, and also look at maybe the policies and practices of assessment of dyslexic type difficulties in your school. Do you have a dyslexia assessment policy? Do you have an additional needs policy? I'm sure you would do if you're in a school. And if you're not in a school setting, then obviously you can actually get a lot of this information online. Some schools actually do publish their policies and practices on their websites, and so you may be able to actually look at some policies of other schools quite easily. Number 3 would be listing any tests, both formal and informal, that are used in your setting currently to assess any aspect of literacy and numeracy difficulties. Also looking at children who don't have difficulties, what national testing is done in your school. If you're not in a school, again, just maybe doing some independent research into what is out there and what's available. And you need to maybe look at the date of publication, publishers, and any extra information that would be useful to go into your resources file. And again, this is all building up towards doing your own assessment. Have a think about what they assess, when would they be used, who uses them, what's the follow-up, which is obviously quite an important point when we're thinking about assessment. And again, this information would be really useful for you later on when you are doing your assessment. If you are working in a school setting, again, have a look at the literacy framework. The documentation is available on the web if you do not have access to it from school. And make some notes, any points that you feel are significant in terms of with the specific learning difficulties assessments in mind. Okay, and then set reading activity. So you're required to read Phillips, Kelly and Symes, chapter 1, and also I will give you some other recommended reading and references at the end of this lecture. So here we are. Here we've got the different references for this lecture. And again, there's some recommended reading in there, particularly Riddick, Living with Dyslexia. I would highly recommend reading that book because we're looking at the more of the social and emotional impact of dyslexia. It gives us that kind of human approach to it. And the Phillips et al. Assessment of learners with dyslexic type difficulties is a really, really good starting point for a lot, and will just sort of direct you into a lot of interesting research papers as well that they reference. Okay, and so then that's it for today's lecture. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to discussing everything with you next week. Thank you.